In the previous lecture, we looked at the origins of Chinese civilization, and we made a number of important points about it. Firstly, we mixed legend with history. We talked about the Hia, the Shang, and the Shu. We showed how the archaeology basically confirms to some degree the legend. And we talked about the omnibus name of the Shang civilization. And we looked at some of the subdivisions of this society. And we made an important point that at the time when Shang dynasty ruled, there were probably all sorts of small states in northern China competing with one another. A patchwork, a word we've used a lot in this course, of different political units who were all vying for power and prestige. And it seems that things like warfare were relatively common. And we ended the lecture with the collapse of the Shang dynasty in 1027 BC. In this lecture, we take the story a little further, and we cover the period between the collapse of the Shang and the collapse of the great Han dynasty, or that stage of Chinese civilization, at about the time of Christ. In the first part of this lecture, I'm going to describe the Western and Eastern Shu periods, a time at which densely populated cities appeared in northern China. It was also a time of intense, even endemic warfare. Then we'll review very quickly the Warring States period of the late first millennium BC, which culminated in one of the defining moments of Chinese history, the first unification of the whole of China under the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi in 221 BC. And we'll show how the lavish outliers of his tomb, terracotta regiments, carts, and many other things, reveal something not only about the way he waged war, but about the lavishness of his court. And then finally, we'll summarize the achievements of the Han dynasty, which brought China in contact with the West via the ancient Silk Route of Central Asia, and with India by connecting to the ancient monsoon wind routes of the Southeast Asia. In other words, we're going to go back to this persistent theme of interconnectedness. In Lecture 28, we saw how urban clusters and states first developed in northern China during the time of the Xia and Shang dynasties, during the period about 2000 to 1027 BC. As I said also, archaeologically, the material remains of these dynasties, such as we know about them, are grouped under the generic archaeological label of the Shang civilization. Now, the third of these legendary dynasties was the Shu. These people were firmly rooted in history, and the rival Shu dynasty overthrew the last Shang ruler in 1027 BC. For the next 2.5 centuries, the centralized government imposed by the Shang disintegrated, as subject kingdoms pulled themselves away from the very loose central authority of the Shang dynasty. This was called the Western Shu period. It was followed in 770 BC by the Eastern Shu period, a time when the rulers of the day, for reasons that we don't understand, moved their capital eastward. It was also a time of dramatic changes in Chinese society. You'll recall that the capital of the Shang and Yang was a very spread out place. It covered about 4 miles. But now things have changed. For the first time, you find classic crowded cities in the classical sense appearing. It was also a time not only of overcrowded cities, but a moment when ironworking technology came into widespread use, affecting military strategy and agriculture. And a time also when trade expanded exponentially, to the point where for the first time we find coinage being used to standardize transactions and the values of items and commodities. In the 8th century BC, Cities still covered large areas, like Anyang had, with the residences of the elite defended by rammed earth walls. Relatively few people lived behind these fortifications. This was the compound of the elite. But 3 centuries later, the character of urban settlement had changed completely. Cities were no longer clusters of compounds, workshops, and rural villages. They were densely occupied, with thousands of inhabitants living in tightly packed precincts. The largest Eastern Shu city, Yangshiatu, may have housed as many as 316,000 people within a compact area of about 7.5 square miles. This was a large city by any standards. It was larger than, say, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, or Teotihuacan, the capital of Mexico. It was larger than many European cities of the day, much larger. But such large cities were rarities. They were also royal centers, with the elite living in palace areas within or close to the cities. Now, in Shang times, there'd been a separation. These compounds were really separate in spatial terms. Now, the enclosures were within the crowded cities, as if perhaps, and this is a guess, royal power was somewhat weakened. At the same time, the function of the city seems to have changed considerably. Eastern Shu cities were centers of government, not only centers of government and of ritual, but for trade and manufacturing in a compacted sort of way. Things were being pulled together. Control was the issue here. And it was closely supervised. For example, these cities had plentiful iron foundries after the 5th century BC, and their products were sold to the surrounding rural population in large urban markets. You've got still the notion of the green circle, the residents of the countryside, the peasantry surrounding these increasingly large and crowded cities. For the first time in China, you got true cities in the classic Western sense, with complex relationships of interdependency with surrounding rural populations. Yes, a chasm separated the two, but there was a considerable interdependence between them. One of the big factors in all these changes was the independent development of metallurgy in China. Now, this occurred considerably later in the West. You'll recall that iron was first smelted somewhere in northern Turkey, probably at about the time of the Hittite civilization, perhaps around 1500 BC. In China, it developed later, but was widespread by 500 BC. When the Chinese started using iron, they had one advantage over the West. Their artisans had long been producing bronze vessels with a high iron content. So, as iron became more and more available, they began to develop fully iron tools. The metal came gradually into use. It was no great invention. It was just a convenient material. And then there was a very, very fascinating difference between iron smelting in the West and in China. Now, Western smiths smelted iron without adding carbon to it. They forged the iron with repeated hammering and heating. This was a very laborious process. The Chinese, on the other hand, with all their expertise with bronze casting and the use of iron for basically alloying copper, added extra carbon to the iron during smelting. This lowered the melting point of the iron and yielded not a spongy sort of bloom, but molten ore. Now, molten ore you can cast, so they cast it into molds to produce finished products, just in the same way as for centuries they had been doing this with bronze. So almost immediately, iron technology in China was way ahead of the West, with all the implications for military strategy and so on, and the widespread use of iron that you can imagine. Not only that, but within a couple of centuries, Chinese smiths had found ways of regulating the amount of carbon taken up by the iron. And this resulted in the creation of a mild steel. And believe it or not, this was far superior to anything in the West until the late Middle Ages. A tremendous technological advance, way ahead of anything in the West. The smiths were extremely adept. The level of production was very high. With organized furnaces, iron was cheaper to produce than bronze, and was soon used to produce enormous numbers, not only of weapons, but agricultural implements. We said in earlier lectures that iron is very much a utilitarian method. Copper is more ornamental. But when you start producing utilitarian tools in large numbers, there is one immediate advantage. They are accessible to a very broad range of the population. And this enabled the Eastern Shu rulers to expand agricultural production in a time of rapidly rising population. They did this by increasing the production of agricultural implements simply by building huge iron refineries close to major forests so that they could acquire the timber and charcoal necessary for large-scale iron smelting. Very clever. And that sort of organization takes very centralized and very ruthless government. And it worked. The Eastern Shu leaders were consummate traders, so much so that early in the 7th century BC, coinage appeared. And this coinage, of a relatively standardized form, stimulated trade throughout China. But it had another advantage too. If you're talking about control, you're talking about taxation and tribute. Now, if you have coinage, you have standard units for taxation or whatever you want. It made it much easier for rulers to collect revenues from their domains. Now, at this time, there was no centralized state in China. There was a hodgepodge of larger and smaller and medium-sized states, most of them autonomous. Believe it or not, there were about 130 separate states in Eastern Shu times. You can imagine the complex political and diplomatic atmosphere in which life unfolded, particularly when you are dealing with states which were headed by very controlling rulers who clearly had ambition and many of them considerable ability. And inevitably, wars broke out, the objective being to try and acquire more territory to take over your neighbors. And between 770 and 458, innumerable small-scale wars broke out, concerned as much with the prestige associated with deploying chariots in display on the battlefield as with territorial expansion. You remember that the chariot came in fairly late in Shang times. Now, this curious mixture of prestige and internecine warfare to acquire territory and subdue your neighbors is known as the period of warring states. And by the 5th century BC, there were now 22 states as opposed to 130. But that's still a lot of states. Now the effects of population growth and mass-produced iron weaponry changed the dynamics of warfare considerably. There were now armies on an unimaginably large scale, with thousands of heavily armed men. A ruler with military ambitions would mass a dense crowd of infantry numbering in the thousands. He would marshal regiments of cavalry. No chariots in this warfare. They were an anachronism now. But there was a new weapon, the crossbow, a Chinese invention. Now, this was a formidable weapon, vastly superior to the standard bow. A weapon capable of propelling an arrow faster and more powerfully than any conventional bow known. This means a number of things. For example, it means that fighting armies can stand off at a greater distance and still fight each other. But even more importantly, and this was a major factor in a landscape where there were many cities, all fortified, the crossbow had greater range and accuracy and was a very useful weapon for people who were defending a city under siege from a large army, because by using the crossbow they could keep the attackers at a distance. The Zhou, or Warring States period, lasted for over 2 centuries, 458 to 221 BC. Military campaigns never ceased. It must have been a very traumatic time to live. Small states frantically built defensive walls around their territories at massive expense to protect themselves. But it was all to no avail. By 300 BC, only 4 major states survived: Qin, Zhou, Han, and Zhou. In 260 BC, after 40 years of almost continual warfare, the ruler of Qin defeated his greatest rival, Zhou, and is said to have slaughtered some 400,000 prisoners in the process. An exaggerated number? Maybe, but I think we should say that the casualties of these wars were enormous. The successor to this ruler completed the task that had been the objective, maybe unspoken, of rulers for centuries. He completed the conquest of all his rivals. And in 221 BC, this remarkable, ruthless, and cruel man proclaimed himself Qin Shi Huangdi, first emperor of a united China. China, for the first time, was an entity, a political, a social, and an economic entity. Shi Huangdi came to power as a result of his military skills. He was a formidable warrior with a mighty army. But, unlike a lot of conquerors, he was also an expert administrative reformer. His reforms were ruthless, befitting a man of ruthless ambition. He broke with the tradition of allowing conquered lords to maintain their lands and divided China into provinces of equal size, or approximately equal size, whose governors only answered to the emperor. He went as far as to order all local histories of earlier times destroyed as part of creating an imperial government. He reinvented history, which is something we'll find happening, for example, with the Aztecs of Mexico. Like every other great empire builder, Shi Huangdi was concerned with efficient communications. He built 5 major trunk roads of rammed earth from his capital at Xianyang, the longest to the southwest, extending over 4,500 miles. Shi Huangdi is also famous for building a great wall in the north to fence off nomads from the arid steppes to the north. This rammed earth fortification, not the wall seen by tourists today, extended over 3,000 miles from the boundaries of Korea to the arid Ordos Desert in the west. The cost of Shui Hangdi's ruthlessly efficient and centralized government was enormous, enormous in people power and enormous in money. By the end of his reign in 210 BC, he was megalomaniac and paranoid. He was buried in a huge sepulchre under a 164-foot-high earthen mound east of the modern city of Heian. This sepulchre has never been excavated, and the marvels in it are known only from legend. It is said to contain a map of China with the 5 major rivers flowing in mercury. It is also said that booby-trapped crossbows were installed to kill looters. The artisans who built the tomb were executed to preserve its secrets. Even if this tomb has been looted, which, to be honest, is pretty likely, the archaeological discoveries that await Chinese archaeologists when they investigate it will be enormous, just to judge from the findings on the periphery. Fortunately, they're in no hurry. They are taking their time, and they will not excavate it until they have the experience and resources to do so, which is something that is absolutely praiseworthy in a world that is always in a hurry to dig things up. The writings of later Chinese historians described these details of the tomb and were thought to be fiction until a vast terracotta regiment came to light in 4 huge tombs dug to the east of the sepulchre, a symbolic guard for the emperor discovered in the 1970s. The largest excavated pit contained 3,210 life-sized terracotta statues of Qin soldiers. The soldiers stand in 11 columns, each depicted in full armor and carrying bronze-tipped spears. The faces are all different. Cavalry and bowmen, even a command and control unit, come from other pits. This remarkable archaeological discovery is a priceless source of information on the efficient armies that kept Qin in power. Qin's dynasty did not survive long after his death. A new dynasty, the Han, took control. Qin's capital was ransacked in 206 BC. The Han, a new dynasty, ruled China for 4 centuries. They rank among the most important dynasties of the country. The Han emperors, and they called themselves emperors, took over the administrative apparatus set up by their predecessor. They were, above all, efficient administrators. They presided over a vast domain, mainly comprising peasant farmers living in the countryside. In AD 2, at the time of Christ, they organized a census which estimated that about 12 million households lived in Han domains. That is, an estimated 58 million people. The Han capital, Chang'an, was across from Shui Hangdi's destroyed city. The rectangular grid pattern of the city encompassed 3.7 by 4.7 miles. The rammed earth walls were 52 feet thick at the base and protected by a moat. Inside the moat lay palaces, shrines, markets, workshops, and residential quarters. It's very interesting to note that the Han rulers constantly worried about feeding their subjects living in this crowded walled city. They never succeeded, despite massive flood control efforts, to control the floods of the Huanghe River, which could cause widespread famine. The result was that during the Han period, southern China, which had high agricultural productivity and abundant iron ore, came into much greater prominence. In another effort to stifle social dissent and also to try and feed everybody, the Han made many industries as well as coinage state monopolies, among them ironworking, which was a logical way to control weaponry and to, in some way, fend off the danger of rebellion. These were also aggressive rulers. The Emperor Wu Di, who reigned from 141 to 87 BC, waged massive campaigns against warrior nomads in the north. Like Shui Hangdi, he was concerned about the security of his domains, so he extended his predecessor's Great Wall far to the west, as far as the Tarim Basin in Mongolia, and established guard towers along it. Now, this expansion of the Great Wall had an unexpected side effect. It provided a protected corridor to the west through Central Asia. This was the first leg of the celebrated ancient Silk Road, which passed silk and other luxuries overland to the west. Few merchants made the entire journey, while the goods were passed from trader to trader, from caravan to caravan along the way. This was a very important development because both goods and ideas flowed into China along this ancient route as well as the other direction, among them Buddhism, which arrived from India in the 1st century AD. Wu Di also campaigned in the south. He campaigned against Vietnamese kingdoms. He and his successors also maintained commercial and diplomatic ties with newly arisen states in Southeast Asia. The Han really looked out. They were traders. They were engaged with the outer world. Han ships traveled as far as India. They brought China into the orbit of the monsoon networks of the ancient Indian Ocean trade. So again, we've got an expanding international world. And until AD 200, when the dynasty fell and China once again was fragmented, China was an active part, the Han were an active part in this huge web of interconnectedness, which now linked China with Southeast Asia with South Asia, South Asia with Arabia and the Persian Gulf, and through the monsoon winds with the Red Sea and East Africa as well. There was an international world now, well established, and right in the eastern core of this was Southeast Asia, where the Chinese, the Han, maintained an active presence of merchants and diplomats who give us a few portraits of the remarkable states which arose in that area just about at the time when Han was beginning to fragment. This lecture's continued the story of Chinese civilization after the collapse of the Shang dynasty. I made a point, and that was how fragmented these states were. And I described the eastern and western Shu, and the development of cities and ironworking, and the endemic warfare which culminated in the unification of China by Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi in 221 BC. I analyzed the steps he took to unify China administratively. He created an empire. And we talked about both the known and potentially known spectacular archaeological discoveries at his great sepulchre. Finally, we traced the fortunes of the Han dynasty, which overthrew his own city, the Qin city, and created a vast dynasty which expanded China's influence along the Silk Road of Central Asia and into Southwest Asia. And by that time, new states were rising into prominence in the southeast, which we will describe in Lecture 30.